I was supposed to be in Dr. H. A. Riss's waiting room at 8 sharp on Tuesday morning, but I was late. Not because of traffic, not because I forgot the appointment. I was late because I was squatting on the concrete floor of my own garage, wiping up a puddle of motor oil with an old rag, oil that had leaked out of my son Paul's beat-up Ford Mustang. He'd said he was taking his wife and kid fishing at the lake last weekend, but the car didn't make it 3 miles before it died on him. It got towed back and had been sitting in the garage ever since. I'm 71, and squatting to clean the floor isn't easy, especially with my damn knee that's more accurate than any weather forecast, cloudy skies coming, and it starts aching. But I couldn't stand seeing that puddle of oil. It looked like a stain burned into the last clean corner of my life. Jack H. A. Riss is my doctor and was my neighbor for 30 years. He frowned so deep when he took my blood pressure that his brow could have crushed a fly. He asked if I'd been sleeping well. I said so. He asked how my daughter-in-law was doing. I said fine. He took off his stethoscope and read me straight in the eyes for a solid 5 seconds. Jack was never one to meddle in other people's business. He's an internist who reads lab reports and CT scans, not human ERTS. But that day he spoke up, turning the conversation awkway RDLY, asking if Paul had been going out a lot at night lately. My stomach dropped. I told him Paul was busy with work. Paul works as a sales manager at an ad agency downtown, always in a crisp suit and a perfectly knotted tie, but his performance had been sliding for 2 years. Sometimes he'd get calls in the middle of the night, and his temper had gotten shorter. Last month he smashed a plate in the kitchen just because I asked him twice where he was headed for the weekend. My daughter-in-law Amy stood there without a word, holding their 5-year-old daughter, sta ring at the floor with her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was just a tiff between the two of them. But Jack didn't see it that way. He told me he'd been at the Walgreens last week picking up his wife's prescription when he spotted Paul at the pharmacy counter grabbing a prescription bag and stuffing it into his jacket pocket like it was something to hide. Jack said he shouldn't have brought it up, but something felt wrong to him, because he'd known Paul since he was a kid, and that boy used to break bones playing soccer without making a sound, but now he looked as wilted as a tomato plant hit by frost. I left the clinic that day and didn't go straight home. I drove to the building where Paul worked and parked across the street, sta ring up at that glass curtain wall. At 11, he came out, no suit jacket, tie hanging loose around his neck, standing by the entrance smoking with a young woman. I recognized her. She was an intern in his department, blonde, skinny as a rail, name was Megan. When she laughed she tilted her head to RD Paul's shoulder, just ba rely, but I saw it clear as day from my car. Paul didn't pull away. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel. When I got home Amy was in the kitchen feeding Bella lunch. Bella's my granddaughter. She's got her mother's big brown eyes and the brightest smile you'll ever see. But she wasn't smiling that day. Her little face was tight, poking at her mashed potatoes with her spoon. I asked Amy what time Paul got home last night. She said she didn't know, she'd been asleep. I noticed a band-aid on the back of her neck and asked what happened. She said she banged it on a kitchen cabinet door. I didn't press further. The cabinet door's on the left, the band-aid was on the right side of her neck. Something heavy and wet settled in my chest. That night I lay in bed sta ring at the ceiling, wide awake. My wife Ma's been gone 6 years, and this old house is just me rattling around in it, but Paul and his family live downstairs. They moved in 3 years ago with all the right words, said it was to take care of me. But now I felt like I was watching a family slip through my fingers, a little more every day. I heard Paul come back upstairs, heavy footsteps, a door slamming harder than it needed to. Then muffled voices, words I couldn't make out, but the tone was wrong. Amy let out a short cry, then nothing. I read at the ceiling and thought about Jack's words. He'd said, "Old friend, your ERT's fine, your blood pressure's manageable, but there's something weighing on you that my machines can't measure." I turned over in bed, and my hand brushed against an old photograph on the nightstand, Ma holding a 1-month-old Paul, her smile so bright it could light up a room. That smile made my eyes sting. I decided right then that sta rooting tomorrow, I was going to keep a close watch on this household. Not because I was a suspicious old man, but because I'd lived 70 years and I knew that before a good home starts falling apart, there are always small signs, like oil stains. You don't wipe them up fast enough and they seep down deep where you'll never scrub them out again. The next morning I was up before dawn. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and listened. At 6:15, Paul's alarm went off. 20 minutes later, he shuffled downstairs in his robe, Rely grunted at me, and poured himself a cup. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes that no amount of shaving could hide. I asked if he wanted eggs, he said no. I asked if his back was still bothering him, he said it was fine. But when he reached for the coffee pot, his sleeve rode up just an inch, and I saw a small bruise on the inside of his forearm, yellowish purple, like a needle mark that was healing. I said nothing. I handed him his coffee and watched him drink it standing up, one hand in his pocket, eyes fixed on his phone screen. He left for work at 7. Amy came down with Bella a few minutes later, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, eyes tired but still soft. She kissed me on the cheek, same as she always did, and said good morning. I asked if she slept okay. She said she did, but her hand trembled slightly when she reached for the cereal box. Bella was chattering away about a butterfly she saw in the backyard, pulling on her mother's sleeve, and Amy smiled down at her, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. After breakfast I told Amy I was going to take a walk to the hardwa store, but I drove straight to the city public records office instead. I waited in line 40 minutes behind a young couple arguing about property taxes, and when I got to the counter, a woman with reading glasses helped me pull up the deed history for my house. The last recorded transfer was 2008, when MA passed and ownership rolled over to me. No liens, no new mortgages, nothing filed in the last year. I exhaled. At least that much was still clean. But on my way out, my phone buzzed. It was Jack, calling me back about the photo of the prescription bag I'd texted him the day before. He told me, and I could hear the gravity in his voice, that the drug was oxycodone, a powerful opioid, tightly controlled, and no doctor prescribes that dosage without a documented history of severe chronic pain. He asked if Paul had any injuries I knew about. I said no. Jack paused on the line and then said, "You'd better figure out where that came from, and you'd better take a look at your son's bank accounts while you're at it." I didn't have his passwords. But I knew he'd set up his computer password when he was 13 and never changed it, because he didn't think I'd ever touch his things. That night, after he'd left for a client dinner, I went into his home office, opened the drawer of his old Dell laptop, and typed in the password I remembered from years ago. It worked on the second try. His email inbox was a disaster, hundreds of unread promotional messages buried under work memos. But a CRCH for the word bank pulled up a statement from a small credit union, showing a balance of less than $200. Another CRCH for loan brought up a message from a finance company, a past due notice for $64,000, 90 days overdue. Attached to that email was a scanned document, and my blood ran cold when I recognized it. It was a copy of the deed to my house, stamped with a note about collateral. I went upstairs to my bedroom, opened the closet, and climbed on a chair to reach the old iron box on the top shelf, the one where I kept the original deed along with M.A. Ruda's rings and a few other valuables. I lifted the lid, my fingers clumsy and slow, and looked inside. The deed was gone. In its place was only M.A. Ruda's old thimble, a tiny silver cap she'd used for mending socks. It sat there alone like a mocking reminder of everything I'd failed to protect. My knees gave out, and I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The room was dark except for the glow of the streetlight coming through the curtain. I sat there for a long time, not moving, feeling the weight of the house press down on me. Paul had taken the deed. He'd given it, or promised it, to someone else. And now the house I'd built with my own hands, the roof that had sheltered my family for 40 years, was hanging by a thread that I hadn't even known was fraying. I went back downstairs and stood in the dark kitchen, opened the refrigerator just to feel the cold air hit my face, and pulled out a beer, one of the ones I kept in the back for when the heat got unbearable. I twisted off the cap, took one long sip, and set the bottle on the counter. Then I picked up my phone, called Jack's number, and let it ring until his sleepy voice answered on the fourth ring. I said, "Jack, I need that lawyer's number tomorrow. Something's happened, and I'm going to have to fight for my own goddamn house." Jack was quiet for a second, then said, "I'll have it ready at the office, you come by first thing, and we'll talk." I hung up, finished the beer, and sat in the dark until the clock on the microwave blinked over to midnight. A new day. I'd have to face it with my eyes wide open, no more pretending that the puddle of oil on the garage floor was just motor oil and not the slow leak of something much more important. Upstairs, Paul's footsteps creaked across the ceiling. He was home. I heard him walk into the bedroom, heard a murmur of voices, then silence. I closed my eyes and prayed, to Allah out there somewhere, that I'd have the strength to do what needed to be done. I got to the public records office the next morning before they even opened the doors. A young black woman behind the counter helped me pull the full history on my property, and I watched her scroll through the digital files with the kind of bored efficiency that said she'd done this 1,000 times. She told me there was no new lien, no mortgage filed against the house since 2008. I asked her if that meant a copy of the deed floating around somewhere couldn't be used to borrow money against the property. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Not unless it's recorded with the county, sir. A photocopy by itself is just a piece of paper." I walked out of that building with a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the house was technically still mine, dread because Paul had given that piece of paper to somebody, and I didn't know who or for what. I drove home slow, taking the back roads through the old neighborhood where Paul grew up, past the playground where he'd scraped his knees and the little league field where he'd struck out more times than I could count. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. When I pulled into my driveway, Amy's Sierra was gone. She must have taken Bella to preschool. I let myself in through the garage and stood in the utility room, looking at the spot where Paul's Mustang had been parked. The oil stain was still there, dried into RK, but the Sierra was gone. I figured he'd taken it to work, though I wasn't sure how he'd gotten it sta route again. Then I noticed a folded piece of paper on the workbench, held down by a greasy socket wrench. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a receipt from a used Sierra lot, dated 3 days ago, for the sale of a 2012 Ford Mustang, condition fair, mileage high, sale price $4,200 RS. The seller's signature was Paul's. He'd sold his own Sierra without telling anyone. I stood there in the half-dark of the garage with that receipt in my hand, and a cold CLA righty settled over me. This wasn't just a bad streak or a rough patch. This was a man methodically dismantling his own life, piece by piece, and I'd been too busy wiping up oil stains to see the engine seizing up right in front of me. I went inside and called Paul's office. His receptionist put me through, and when he answered, his voice was wary, the way it always got when he knew I was calling about something he didn't want to talk about. I said, "Paul, I found the receipt for your CAR." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, I needed the cash." I asked him what he needed $4,200 RS for so badly that he'd sell his own transportation. He said, "Bills," and then he said he had to go because a client was waiting. Before he hung up, I told him we needed to talk that night, the real kind of talk, not the kind where he brushed me off with half-truths. He said okay, but I didn't believe him. I spent the rest of the morning doing something I'd never done before. I went through Paul's old room, the one he'd lived in as a teenager, now mostly a storage space for boxes of Bella's outgrown clothes and holiday decorations. I opened his closet and found a shoebox tucked behind some winter coats. Inside were bank statements, 6 months' worth, all from a credit union I'd never heard of. I sat on his old bed and read them cover to cover, watching the numbers spiral downway a dwindling balance punctuated by RGE withdrawals with no clear source. The last statement showed a negative balance, overdrawn by over $1,000 RS. My hands shook holding those papers. At noon, I drove to the bank where Paul and Amy had their joint checking account, the one I'd helped them open when they got my ride. I had no authority to access it, but I knew the branch manager, a man named Frank who'd coached Paul's little league team back in the day. I explained that I was doing some family financial planning and asked him to confirm whether the account was in good standing. Frank looked uncomfortable, but he pulled up the information and told me, in a low voice, that the account had been closed 6 weeks ago. Closed, he said, with a negative balance that had been written off. Closed. They'd closed their joint account and Paul hadn't told Amy. I walked out of that bank with my legs feeling hollow. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and STA read through the windshield at the hot pavement shimmering in the midday sun. The picture forming in my head was ugly and getting uglier. My son was drowning, and instead of reaching for a rope, he was pulling everything else down with him. That afternoon I went home and waited. I sat in my old recliner in the living room, the one that I had bought at a yard sale in 1995 and refused to replace because she said the springs were still good. I sat there and watched the clock tick from 2 to 3 to 4. Bella got home with Amy at 4:15, and I heard them coming through the front door, Bella's giggles and Amy's soft shushing. Amy looked surprised to see me sitting in the living room instead of out back fiddling with the roses. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said I was fine, just tired. I asked her how the joint account was doing, if they'd saved enough for that trip to Disney they'd been talking about last Christmas. Amy's face went still, the kind of still that tells you more than a scream ever could. She said, "We don't use that account much anymore, Paul handles the money, I just take the cash for groceries." I asked if she knew the account had been closed. She blinked at me, her lips parooting slightly, and then she sat down hard on the arm of the sofa, like her legs had given out. She said, "Closed." I said, "Yes, closed 6 weeks ago." She sat there in silence for a full minute, and I could see the hairs turning behind her eyes, all the little things she'd brushed aside sta rooting to click together. Amy didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just got up and went to the kitchen and sta root making dinner, chopping onions with a steady, almost robotic rhythm, her face pale and fixed. I left her alone. Bella came and sat on my lap, and I let her tell me about the butterfly she'd seen again, a yellow one this time, and I nodded along, but my mind was on Paul, on what I was going to say to him when he finally walked through the door. He didn't come home for dinner. Amy and I ate with Bella in our silence, the only sounds the clink of forks and Bella's occasional questions about why Daddy wasn't eating with them. Amy told her Daddy was working late. I saw her hand tighten on her knife when she said it. After dinner, Amy put Bella to bed and then sat down across from me in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea she hadn't touched. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, the softness gone from her face, replaced by a hard, brittle wariness. She said, "Dad, is there anything else I should know?" I thought about the prescription bottle, about the deed, about the car, about all the pieces I'd collected, and I told her the truth. I said there were things I was still figuring out, but I'd tell her everything once I had the whole picture. She nodded, a slow, heavy nod, and then she said, "I've been stupid, haven't I, trusting him like this?" I told her she wasn't stupid, she was in love, and there's a difference, but I wasn't sure she believed me. Paul finally came home at 11:30. I was in the kitchen, still sitting at the table, waiting for him. He walked through the back door, and when he saw me, he stopped in his tracks, his shoulders sagging like he already knew what was coming. I gestured for him to sit, and after a long hesitation, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. The kitchen light was dim, but I could see the shadows under his eyes, the sallow tint to his skin. He looked like a man who hadn't had a good meal or a good night's sleep in weeks. I told him about the bank, about the closed account, about the statements I'd found in his closet. I told him I'd seen the prescription from Walgreens, and I told him I knew about the deed being gone from the iron box. I kept my voice level, low, not because I was calm but because I was holding myself together by a thread that could snap at any moment. Paul sat there with his hands flat on the table, sta ring at his own knuckles. He tried to speak twice and stopped both times. On the third try, he said, "Dad, I got in over my head. It sta root small, just a few missed payments, then I borrowed to cover those, and then the interest ballooned, and Megan said her brother had a business opportunity that would turn it all around. I asked him if Megan was the blonde from the office. He flinched and then nodded. He sta root to talk faster, the words tumbling out like he couldn't stop them once the dam broke. He told me he'd lost a huge client for his company last year and got a warning that his job was on the line, so he'd been trying to make up for it by taking side projects that paid poorly and drained his time. The credit card debt sta root at 3,000 and multiplied faster than he could track. Megan had offered to help, said her brother had a restaurant deal, all he needed was a quick injection of capital, and she'd convinced Paul to put up the deed as a guarantee, just a formality. Then Megan's brother Desape read, the money was gone. Megan turned around and said Paul owed her directly, the full amount plus penalties. He said he'd been trying to negotiate with her, trying to get the deed back, but she wouldn't budge. The car sale was the last desperate attempt to scrape together enough to make a payment and buy himself some time. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he was done, I asked him about the oxycodone. His face went pale, and he said he'd gotten it from Megan too. She knew a doctor who was willing to write extra prescriptions, and she said selling them on the side could make him quick money to pay down the debt. He swore he'd never taken any of it himself, just held on to it. I looked at his arm, the bruise I'd seen, and he pulled down his sleeve, his eyes wet and pleading. He said that was from a fall, nothing else. I didn't know what to believe. I sat there across from my own son, and I realized I'd reached the point where I couldn't tell truth from lie anymore, not because I was too old, but because he'd gotten so good at mixing the two together. I told him I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to throw him out, but I was going to find a way to fix this mess, and he was going to help me. He nodded, wiping his face with his palm. Then I asked him one more question. I asked him where he'd hidden the deed after he took it from the iron box. He looked at me with a strange, confused expression and said, I gave it to Megan, Dad, it's with her. That was when I knew there was something he still wasn't telling me. Because the deed I'd seen in the public records office, the one that was still clean and unencumbered, that was the original. I'd held it in my own hands 30 years ago when I paid off the mortgage. And if he'd given Megan the deed from the box, then the box had held the original. But the original was gone from the box, and no new deed had been recorded against my house. That meant Paul had given her something else, or he'd given her a copy and kept the real one for himself, or someone else had removed it before he got to it. My head was spinning with possibilities, and I realized I couldn't trust a single word Paul had just told me. I sent him to bed and stayed in the kitchen until the clock hit 2 in the morning. Then I went upstairs to the attic, climbing the rickety pull-down ladder with a flashlight in my teeth. I rummaged through old boxes of Christmas lights and Rada's craft supplies until I found it, the rusty old tin kai box she'd used for her backup system. It was tucked behind a pile of quilts, covered in dust. I pried the lid open with my fingernails and felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled my knees. Inside, nestled between a yellowed envelope and a recipe card for Rada's apple pie, lay the original deed to my house. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out. Rada's handwriting was on the envelope, backup copy for the old man, keep this one safe, don't let Paul get curious. I sat down on a dusty trunk right there in the attic, holding that deed like it was made of gold. Rada had known. She'd known our son had a restless streak, a tendency to look for shortcuts, and she'd made a backup plan without telling anyone. I wished she was there beside me, just so I could say her name out loud and thank her for saving me from my own foolish trust. But she wasn't, so I just sat there in the dark attic, the paper crinkling in my grip, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. I had the deed. I had the truth about the debt. I had the pieces I needed to start putting things back together. But first, I had to make Paul tell me the rest of it, the real rest of it, and I had to figure out what Megan was really after. That woman had squeezed my son dry and she wasn't done yet. I could feel it in my bones, the way I'd always felt a transmission about to fail before it root grinding. Megan was a predator, and she'd picked my boy because she knew he was too proud to ask for help until it was too late. I climbed down from the attic, the deed tucked inside my shirt against my chest, and I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and locked it for the first time in years. I laid the deed on my nightstand, next to Rava's photo, and I lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, sta ring at the ceiling. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was creeping across the sky. I'd have a long day ahead of me, and I needed every ounce of strength I had left. But I had the deed. That was the start. The rest, I was going to have to earn the hard way, one truth at a time. The deed stayed pressed against my chest all night. I slept, just dozed in fits, waking every time the house creaked or a car passed on the street. At 6 in the morning, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread out in front of me, studying the signatures and the notary stamps like they were a treasure map. I'd owned this house for 42 years, but I'd never really looked at the deed, not this closely. Rava had handled most of the paperwork, she was the one with the head for numbers and legal forms. I just signed where she told me. Now I was trying to teach myself enough about property law to understand what kind of hole my son had dug for himself. I heard Paul's alarm go off upstairs, then the muffled thud of his feet crossing the floor. I waited until he came down, still in his bathrobe, his hair sticking up in odd directions. He stopped when he saw the deed on the table. His face went through about 4 different expressions in 2 seconds, surprise, confusion, guilt, and something that looked almost like relief. He said, "Where did you get that?" I told him about the Kai box, about Rava's handwriting on the envelope, about how she'd hidden the original up in the attic years ago. I watched his face as I said it, looking for any sign that he already knew about the backup copy, but he looked genuinely surprised. He sat down slowly, reaching for the deed like he wanted to touch it, but I pulled it back. I said, "You gave Megan a copy, didn't you? Not the real thing?" He nodded, his mouth hanging open slightly. He said, "She asked for the original, but I couldn't bring myself to hand it over. I thought if I gave her a copy maybe she wouldn't notice the difference right away. I'd planned to tell her it was the real one and then buy time to figure something else out." I had to give him credit for that, at least. He'd been stupid, but he hadn't been stupid enough to hand over the only thing that truly mattered. Still, it didn't change the fact that Megan was out there holding what she thought was a legitimate piece of collateral, and when she found out it was worthless, she'd come after Paul twice as hard. I told him that, and he hung his head. He said, "She's already figured it out, Dad. She called me 3 days ago screaming about the copy being fake. She said I'd cheated her, and she'd make me pay one way or another." That was right around the time I sold the Mustang. I'd been trying to scrape together enough cash to make her go away quietly, but I didn't even get close. I took a long drink of my coffee and let the silence stretch out. Then I told Paul what we were going to do. We were going to meet Megan, the 3 of us, and we were going to lay the cards on the table. I'd tell her the deed was a fake and she had no legal claim to my house. Then I'd give her a deadline to accept a repayment plan for whatever legitimate money Paul owed her, or I'd take her to court for attempting to defraud an elderly homeowner. Paul looked at me like I'd grown a second head. He said, "Dad, you can't do that. She's got connections, she's got a lawyer she works with, she'll crush us." I told him I'd been crushed before, by the recession in '08, by losing Rava, by watching my own pension shrink. I was still standing. She could bring her lawyer, I'd bring Jack's lawyer, and we'd see who had the stronger case. Paul didn't argue. I think he was too tired, too worn down to fight against anything that looked like a plan. He nodded, rubbed his face with both hands, and said he'd call Megan and set up a meeting. I told him to do it right there, at the kitchen table, on speakerphone. He hesitated, but I fixed him with the look I used to give him when he was 10 and trying to sneak out of mowing the lawn. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Megan answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and irritable. She said, "What do you want, Paul? You got my money yet?" Paul stammered something about wanting to meet in person, talk things over. Megan laughed, not a nice laugh, it was thin and mean. She said, "You can talk all you want, you got nothing to offer me." Paul glanced at me, and I nodded. He said, "My father wants to be there too." There was a pause on the other end, and then Megan said, "The old man, what's he got to do with this?" Paul said, "Everything, it's his house." Another pause, longer this time. Then Megan said, "Fine, tomorrow at noon, the diner on Main Street, and if you try any tricks, I'll have my lawyer file a lien on that house by the end of the week." She hung up before Paul could respond. I spent the rest of the day getting ready. I went to see Jack H.A. Riss at his office, and he gave me the name of a lawyer, an older man named Morris who'd retired from corporate law but still did occasional consulting work. Jack called him right there and explained the situation. Morris sounded gruff and practical on the phone, told me he'd need copies of everything I had, the deed, the emails, the bank statements, any documentation of Paul's debt to Megan. He said he'd review it overnight and give me his opinion before the meeting. I thanked him and headed home with a small flicker of hope. But when I walked in the front door, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Amy was sitting on the stairs with Bella on her lap, both of them staring at me with wide, serious eyes. Amy said, "Dad, Paul's gone." I asked what she meant. She said he'd packed a duffel bag about an hour after I left, mumbled something about needing to handle things on his own, and drove off in the old Honda he'd bought to replace the Mustang. He hadn't said where he was going. Amy's voice was flat, like she'd run out of TRS and was just reporting the facts. I felt a spike of anger in my chest, sharp and hot. The boy was trying to run again, do things his own way, make everything worse in the process. I called his cell phone and got voicemail. I left a message telling him to come home immediately, that we were going to handle this together, that running would only make things worse. Then I sat down next to Amy and Bella on the stairs, and we waited. 2 hours passed, then 3. I called Paul 4 more times, each one going to voicemail. Amy made dinner, but nobody ate much. Bella asked where Daddy was, and Amy told her he was running an errand. The little girl didn't buy it, but she was too polite to push. She ate her macaroni and cheese in silence, her big eyes rooting between us. At 8:30, my phone finally rang. It was Paul, but his voice was different, strained and shaky. He said, "Dad, I'm at Megan's apartment. I came here to talk to her alone, but she called the cops." I told him to stay calm, asked if he'd done anything stupid. He said no. He'd just knocked on her door and tried to reason with her, and she'd told him she had a protection order against him that he didn't know about, something she'd filed weeks ago with a bunch of lies about him threatening her. The cops showed up and told him he was trespassing and violating the order. They weren't arresting him, but they'd taken his statement and told him to leave and not come back. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. Megan had been planning this. She'd filed a protection order weeks ago, probably the moment she realized the deed was a fake. She was building a paper trail to make Paul look like the aggressor, the unstable one, the one who needed to be neutralized. It was a classic move, and my son had walked right into it. I told Paul to stay where he was. I'd come pick him up. He was at a gas station 2 blocks from her apartment, sitting in his car with his head in his hands. I drove over and found him looking pale and hollow. He got in my truck without a word, and I drove him home. The whole ride, he kept apologizing over and over. I told him to save his breath and use it to tell the truth to Morris the lawyer tomorrow. That night, after everyone was in bed, I sat alone in the garage and looked at the oil stain I'd tried to scrub off the concrete. It was still there, faded but visible. I thought about Rada, about the way she used to say that Paul had her stubborn streak and my temper, a dangerous combination. I wished she was here to tell me what to do next, but she wasn't, so I had to figure it out myself. I had the deed, I had Morris on my side, and I had a son who'd finally hit bottom and couldn't dig any deeper. That was something. The next morning, I called Morris and told him about the protection order. He was quiet for a moment, then said it was a complication but not a catastrophe. He told me to bring Paul to his office at 11, before the meeting with Megan. We'd go over everything, and he'd coach Paul on what to say and what not to say. I hung up feeling a little steadier, but still with a knot in my gut that wouldn't loosen. Paul was quiet during the drive to Morris's office. He read out the window at the passing streets, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. I wanted to say something encouraging, but I was too tired to find the right words. Instead, I just drove. Morris was a tall, lean man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been rivet out of old wood. He shook our hands firmly and sat us down in his cluttered office, stacks of files and law books everywhere. He listened to Paul's story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Paul finished, Morris set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He said, "The protection order is a problem, but not a permanent one." He explained that Paul needed to stay away from Megan entirely, no phone calls, no texts, no showing up at her building. Any contact would violate the order and give her more ammunition. But the financial dispute, that was separate. Morris said he could help us negotiate a settlement that would keep the house safe and minimize Paul's exposure, as long as we had all the documentation. Paul nodded along, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was red, deeper than he'd ever admit. I put my hand on his back and felt him flinch, then relax slightly. We went over the documents, organized them in chronological order, and practiced what Paul would say if Megan brought up certain accusations. By the time 11:30 rolled around, I felt like we had a fighting chance. We met Megan at the diner on Main Street. She was already sitting in a booth when we walked in, wearing a tight black blouse and RK sunglasses, even though the place was dimly lit. There was a man with her, young, sharp-faced, with a briefcase on the seat beside him. Her lawyer. Morris nodded at the man, CL and professional, and we slid into the booth across from them. Megan didn't even look at Paul. She looked at me, a long, measuring stare, and then she smiled a thin, cold smile. She said, "So the old man finally shows up. I told you, Paul, your daddy can't save you from this." Morris spoke before I could, laying out the facts in a calm, even tone. He explained that the deed Paul had given Megan was a copy, not the original, and that without the original filed with the county, she had no lien on the house. He told her she had no legal claim to the property and any attempt to pursue one would be challenged in court. Megan's smile flickered. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered something to her, and she listened, her jaw tightening. Then she leaned forward, rested her elbows on the table, and said, "Fine, you want to play hardball? Let me tell you what your son did. He took money from me, my personal savings, under the promise that it was an investment, and he lost it all. I've got bank records, I've got texts, I've got emails. That's $64,000 I gave him, and I want every cent back. And I've got a protection order that says he threatened me. You think a judge is going to side with a man who threatened a woman over a piece of paper?" Morris didn't flinch. He said, "Let's not pretend this was a simple loan between friends. You induced my client to give you a fraudulent deed to his father's house as collateral, and you threatened him when he couldn't produce additional funds. That's coercion, and it's going to look bad in front of a judge." He suggested a payment plan, a reasonable one, with a signed agreement that would release Paul from any further obligations once the principal was paid off in full. Megan read at him, her eyes hard and calculating. The lawyer whispered to her again, and this time she nodded, "Just rely." She said, $50,000, paid over 18 months, with monthly installments of no less than $2,000, and I'll drop the protection order. Paul made a choking sound beside me. $50,000 was almost his entire annual salary. But Morris leaned in and said, $35,000, over 3 years, monthly payments of $1,000, and you drop the order and sign an agreement that this settles all claims. That's my final offer. The negotiating went back and forth for another 10 minutes, sharp words and legal posturing, but eventually they settled at $40,000. Paid over 2 years, Megan signed the agreement with a furious flourish, and her lawyer initialed the changes. Morris signed on our behalf, and Paul sat there like a man who'd just been told he had a terminal illness but also a cure. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for a long time, hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. We walked out of that diner and stood on the sidewalk under a pale winter sun. Paul turned to me and said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said I knew. Then I told him we'd find a way to make the payments, even if it meant me going back to work part-time at my old age. He root to argue, but I held up my hand. I said, "We're a family, that means we carry the weight together. You made a mess, and we're going to clean it up. But you have to do something for me first. You have to tell Amy the truth, all of it, from the beginning. No more lies. Paul swallowed hard and nodded. We drove home in silence, the signed agreement sitting on the seat between us like a fragile truce. When we pulled into the driveway, Amy was standing on the front porch with Bella in her ARMS, watching us approach. I got out of the truck, and Paul followed. He walked up the steps slowly, stopped in front of Amy, and then he fell to his knees right there on the porch, in front of the whole neighborhood, and he sta root talking. I couldn't hear all the words from where I stood, but I saw Amy's face change, saw the hard lines around her mouth soften, saw Bella reach down and pat her father's head. I turned away and walked to the backyard, giving them their moment. The rose bushes were winter dormant, but I could already see the tiny buds sta rooting to swell at the tips of the branches. Spring wasn't far off. The next few weeks were the longest of my life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quiet. The kind of quiet that sits in a house after a storm, when the wind has stopped and the rain has let up, but everything is still wet and broken and you don't know where to start sweeping. Paul kept his word. He sat down with Amy that night on the porch and told her everything, the whole ugly pile of it, the credit card debt, the lost investment, the lies about the deed, the money he'd borrowed from Megan, the prescription pills he'd held but never sold. I wasn't there for the conversation, I made sure of that, but I heard Amy's voice through the walls, sometimes sharp and sometimes so low I couldn't make out the words. She didn't kick him out. That was the first good sign. But she didn't exactly welcome him back with open arms either. For the first week, she moved into Bella's room, and Paul slept on the sofa in the basement. They ate meals together at the same table, but the conversation was thin, mostly about Bella's school and what needed to be picked up from the grocery store. I stayed out of it as much as I could, but I kept a close eye on both of them, the way I used to check the oil and water levels in a car after a long road trip. No signs of major breakdown yet, but everything was running a little rough. Paul sta root going to a counselor once a week, a recommendation from Morris the lawyer, who said it would look good for his case if he could show he was taking steps to address his behavior. I drove him to the first appointment myself, waited in the parking lot reading an old newspaper while he sat inside for an hour. When he came out, his eyes were red, but he looked lighter somehow, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for too long. He didn't tell me what they talked about, and I didn't ask. The money was the hard $40,000 RS, spread over 2 years, with interest that Morris had negotiated down to almost nothing. But it was still $40,000 RS that didn't exist in our family budget. Paul took on extra hours at work, came home late most nights, and on weekends he sta root doing handyman jobs for neighbors, fixing leaky faucets and patching drywall. I'd taught him some of those skills when he was a teenager, and I was surprised at how much he remembered. He came home with paint on his jeans and splinters in his fingers, but he brought cash, small amounts, 100 here, 200 there, and he handed it to Amy without a word. She'd take it, count it, and put it into a new envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer labeled debt. I did my part too. I called up the old garage where I worked for 30 years and asked if they needed a part time hand. The owner, a kid in his 40s named Danny who'd sta root as my apprentice back in the 90s, laughed and said he'd been trying to get me to come back for years. 2 days a week, I'd go in and do oil changes and tire rotations, simple stuff that I could handle without killing my knees. The pay was lousy, minimum wage and a showry of the tips, but it added up. I sta root putting my social security check directly into a separate account, the one I'd set up for Bella's college fund years ago, and redirected the garage money to the family pot. Amy tried to argue with me about it, said I'd reneged my retirement. I told her my retirement could wait another year or two, Bella couldn't wait for her grandfather to stop being stubborn. Megan stayed away, just like the agreement said. But I knew her type, the kind of person who circled back when you least expected it. I made sure Morris kept copies of all the signed documents, and I took photos of the deed on my phone, just in case. Every time an unfamiliar ARCAR drove down our street, I watched it until it passed. Every time the phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared. There's a difference. The hardest part wasn't the money or Megan or even Paul's lies. The hardest part was watching Amy. She moved through the house like a ghost for those first few weeks, going through the motions of king and cleaning and taking care of Bella, but there was something missing behind her eyes. She'd always been quick to laugh, quick to offer a hug. Now she was careful, measured. She'd look at Paul across the dinner table and I could see her studying him, evaluating every word he said, every gesture he made, like she was trying to decide if this version of him was the real one or just another act. I didn't blame her. Trust isn't a light switch you can flip back on. It's more like a bone that takes months to heal after a break, and it never quite feels the same after a ARD. One evening in the early spring, I found her out on the back porch, sitting on the steps, sta ring at the rose bushes. The first buds were sta rooting to show, tiny green tips pushing through the brown stems. I sat down next to her, my old joints complaining, and we watched the sunset in silence for a while. Then she said, "Dad, do you think he's really changed?" I thought about it. I thought about the way Paul had held Bella a little tighter lately, the way he'd sta root leaving his phone face up on the table instead of hiding it, the way he said please and thank you to Amy with a sincerity that had been missing for years. I told her I didn't think people changed all at once, but I'd seen him making small choices, day after day, and those small choices added up. She nodded, wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, and said, "I want to believe it." I told her she didn't have to decide all at once, she could wait and watch, and that was okay. Around that same time, Paul came home one night with a strange look on his face. He'd been at his counseling appointment, and he sat down across from me in the living room, his hands clasped between his knees. He said, "Dad, the counselor thinks I should talk to you about something." I braced myself. He said, "I've been thinking a lot about Mom, about how she used to handle things when I screwed up as a kid." He paused, struggling for words. Then he said, "I treated you like you were just an old man who needed to be managed, not a father who deserved to know the truth. I took the easy way out, every time. And I'm sorry for that, more than I can say." I didn't know what to say back. I sat there looking at my son, a grown man with a family of his own, and I saw the little boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to tell him stories about the cars I'd fixed. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder, squeezed it once, hard. I said, "You don't need to tell me you're sorry, you need to show me." And he nodded, understanding that weekend, we did something we hadn't done in years. We got up early, drove to the hardware store, and bought lumber and paint. Paul built a new set of shelves for the garage, sturdy ones that could hold the boxes of tools and spare parts that had been cluttering up the floor. I helped where I could, measuring and handing him nails, and we worked side by side in a comfortable rhythm, just like the old days. Bella came out to watch, sitting on an overturned bucket, and she handed us paintbrushes and asked questions about every single thing we did. It was simple and ordinary and perfect. Amy made lunch and brought it out on a tray, sandwiches and lemonade, and we all sat on the garage floor eating together, laughing at something stupid Bella said about a squirrel that had run across the roof. That was the moment I realized we were going to be okay. Not perfect, not healed overnight, but okay. The cracks were still there, but we were learning to live with them, and maybe even patch them up one at a time. The payments continued. Every month, Amy wrote a check to Megan's lawyer, and every month, she balanced the family accounts on a spreadsheet she'd taught herself to build. She'd gotten a part-time job at a local accounting firm, doing data entry 3 evenings a week after Bella went to bed. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her something of her own, a sense that she was contributing to the solution instead of just surviving the mess. Paul's extra work was bringing in enough to cover the payments and still leave a little breathing room, and for the first time in months, I saw him smile, a real smile, not the forced, tight one he'd been wearing like a mask. We settled into a new routine. I'd get up early, make coffee, and sit on the front porch watching the sun come up over the neighborhood. Bella would join me sometimes, still in her pajamas, climbing onto my lap and asking me to tell her stories about when her daddy was a little boy. I'd tell her about the time Paul tried to fix his bicycle chain and ended up with grease all over his face, or the time he fell out of a tree and broke his arm and didn't cry until he saw his mother's face. Bella ate those stories up like candy, her eyes wide and delighted. And I'd look at her and see the future, a little girl who would grow up knowing that families could break and mend, that love wasn't about being perfect, it was about sticking around when things got hard. The winter melted into spring, and spring bloomed into a green summer. The rose bushes exploded with color, deep reds and pinks, the same ones I had planted 30 years ago. I spent hours out there, pruning and watering, and sometimes Amy would come out and help me, pulling weeds and deadheading the spent flowers. We'd talk about small things, what Bella had learned in kindergarten, what recipe she wanted to try for dinner, nothing heavy, just the gentle stuff of daily life. But I could feel the trust rebuilding between us, brick by reeful brick. One afternoon in July, I got a letter from Morris. It was short and formal, confirming that Megan had made no further claims and that the protection order against Paul had officially expired. I read it twice, folded it up, and tucked it into the key box in the attic, next to the deed that had hidden all those years ago. The box was almost full now, stuffed with documents and receipts and bank statements, the whole messy history of this chapter of our lives. I closed the lid and put it back on the shelf, and I felt a weight lift off my chest, not the whole weight, but enough to let me breathe a little deeper. That evening, I gathered everyone in the living room. Paul and Amy sat on the couch, Bella on the floor with her crayons, and I stood in front of the fireplace, the way I used to when I was telling them a story. I told them about the letter, about the expiration of the protection order, about how we'd officially made it through the worst of it. Paul's face broke into a grin, the first full, uninhibited smile I'd seen on him in years. Amy sta crying, the good kind of crying, and she grabbed Paul's hand and held it tight. Bella looked up and said, "Does that mean Megan won't bother us anymore?" I told her it did, and she went back to her drawing, satisfied. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went out to the garage and sat on the tool chest, looking at the new shelves Paul had built. They were sturdy and straight, good workmanship. I traced my finger along the edge of one shelf and thought about all the things we'd been through, the lies and the secrets and the fear, and I thought about how we'd come out on the other side, not unscathed, but still standing. Eva would have been proud. Not of the way we'd made mistakes, but of the way we'd found our way back. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and bacon. I walked into the kitchen and found Paul at the stove, flipping pancakes with one hand and holding a cup of coffee with the other. Amy was at the table, reading the newspaper and laughing at something, and Bella was already in her high chair, covered in syrup. Paul turned and saw me standing there, and he said, "Good morning, Dad, sit down, breakfast is almost ready." I pulled out my chair, the same one I'd sat in for 30 years, and I sat down and looked at my family, the three of them gathered around that table, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like I was home. The summer rolled on, hot and lazy, the kind of summer that makes you forget there was ever a winter at all. The rose bushes were in full bloom, a riot of red and pink that Eva would have loved. I spent my mornings out there, deadheading and watering, and my afternoons at the garage, elbow deep in oil and grease, doing the work I'd done my whole life. Danny, the young owner, kept telling me I didn't have to come in so often, but I liked it. I liked the smell of the shop, the sound of wrenches clanking against metal, the easy rhythm of a job I knew by heart. And I liked the money, even if it was small. Every paycheck went straight into the family pot, and I watched the debt shrink month by month, slow but steady. Paul was a different man. Not overnight, not all at once, but in little ways that added up. He came home from work on time, most nights, and when he didn't, he called ahead and told Amy where he was. He leaving his phone on the kitchen counter when he got home, screen up, no more hiding. He played with Bella in the backyard, taught her how to throw a softball, helped her build a birdhouse that ended up lopsided but functional. He even sta root king dinner once a week, simple stuff like spaghetti and meatballs, but he did it with a kind of pride that made me smile. The counseling was helping. He didn't talk about it much, but I could see the difference. He was less jumpy, less defensive. When Amy asked him a question, he answered it straight, no hedging, no deflecting. He sat at the dinner table with his shoulders relaxed instead of hunched up around his ears. One night, after Bella was in bed, I heard him and Amy talking in the living room, their voices low and easy, and there was laughter in there, real laughter, the kind I hadn't heard in this house for a long time. Amy was thriving. Her part-time job at the accounting firm had turned into something more. They'd offered her a full-time position with benefits, sta rooting in the fall. She'd been nervous about taking it, worried about how it would affect Bella, but Paul had told her to go for it, that he'd adjust his schedule to handle school pickups and drop-offs. I'd never seen her look so alive, so confident. She walked through the house with a new energy, planning and organizing and making lists. The spreadsheet on the kitchen counter had become her command center, tracking every dollar, every payment, every milestone. We were 3 months ahead of schedule on the debt. That felt good. The payments to Megan continued, but they'd become routine, just another line item in the monthly budget. I sometimes wondered what she was doing with that money, whether she'd moved on to some other scheme, some other family to pick apart. But I tried not to think about her too much. She was a chapter one was ready to close. August came, hot and heavy, and with it, Bella's 6th birthday. She'd been talking about it for weeks, a princess party in the backyard, with streamers and balloons and a cake shaped like a castle. Amy went all out, decorating the porch and the rose bushes with pink and purple, ordering a massive cake from the bakery downtown. Paul built a little wooden stage for the kids to play on, and I set up the lawn chairs in a semicircle, the same ones we'd used for backyard barbecues when Paul was Bella's age. The day of the party, the sky was clear and blue, not a cloud in sight. Bella woke up early, bouncing on my bed at 6 in the morning, shouting that she was 6 now and she was the queen of everything. I laughed and let her pull me out of bed, my old niece protesting but my ERT light. The whole family worked together to set up, Paul hanging streamers, Amy arranging flowers and mason jars, Bella directing everyone with the imperious authority of a 6-year-old who knew exactly what she wanted. The guests sta route arriving at noon. Bella's friends from kindergarten, their parents, a few neighbors who'd known Paul since he was a boy. The backyard filled with noise and color, kids running around, parents chatting and drinking lemonade, the smell of burgers on the grill. I found a spot on the porch steps where I could see everything, and I sat there with a cold beer, watching my family. Paul was the grill master, flipping burgers and hot dogs with the kind of focus he used to give to his big work presentations. Amy was circulating with a tray of cupcakes, laughing and talking with the other moms. Bella was in the center of it all, wearing a sparkly princess crown and a pink dress, surrounded by her little friends, her laughter rising above the noise like a bell. I sat there and soaked it all in, the sounds and the smells and the warmth of the sun on my shoulders. Around 2 in the afternoon, after the cake had been cut and the presents had been opened, Paul walked over and sat down next to me on the steps. He had a plate of cake in one hand and a soda in the other, and he looked tired but happy, sweat on his brow, a smile on his face. He said, "Dad, can I tell you something?" I said sure. He took a breath and looked out at the yard, at Bella chasing a butterfly, at Amy helping a little boy with a scraped knee. He said, "I was thinking about how close I came to losing all of this. Not just the house, not just the money, but her, Bella, you. I came so close, Dad, and I didn't even see it happening. I was too deep in my own head, too proud to ask for help, too red to admit I was failing. I didn't say anything. I just listened." Paul went on, his voice low and a little shaky. He said, "That night you found me in the garage, wiping up that oil stain, I knew you were onto me. I should have told you everything then. But I was so ashamed, I couldn't get the words out. And then everything spiraled, and I kept thinking if I could just fix it myself, make it go away, nobody would have to know. But it doesn't work that way, does it? You can't fix a thing by pretending it isn't broken. I took a sip of my beer and let the silence hang for a moment. Then I said, no, you can't. But you can fix it by picking up the tools and getting your hands dirty. And that's what you've been doing, Paul. You've been doing the work. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, but he was smiling. He said, I love you, Dad. I told him I loved him too, and I clapped him on the shoulder, hard, the way I used to when he was a boy, and he'd done something that made me proud. That evening, after the last guest had gone home and the backyard was quiet and littered with streamers and empty cups, we sat on the porch, the four of us, watching the sun go down. Bella was asleep on Amy's lap, her crown askew, a SMEAR of frosting still on her cheek. Paul had his arm around Amy, and she was leaning into him, her eyes half closed, peaceful. I sat in my old rocking chair, creaking back and forth, and I thought about how far we'd come. A lot of people would have given up. A lot of families would have shattered under the weight of that much debt, that much deceit, that much fear. But we hadn't. We'd held on, not perfectly, not gracefully, but we'd held on. And now here we were, on a warm August evening, watching the fireflies start to blink in the twilight. I thought about Rada, about how she'd always believed in second chances. She'd been the one who taught me that love wasn't about never making mistakes, it was about being willing to clean up the mess together. I'd spent a lot of nights in the past year wishing she was here, wishing I could ask her what to do, but now I realized she'd been here all along, in the Kai box in the attic, in the rose bushes she'd planted, in the quiet strength she'd passed down to Paul and Amy and Bella. She'd left us everything we needed. We just had to find it. The debt was almost paid off. Another 6 months, maybe less, and we'd be free of it entirely. Paul's work was stable, Amy's new job was rooting in a few weeks, and Bella was thriving, a happy, confident little girl who didn't remember the bad days, only the good ones. I'd keep going to the garage as long as my body let me, not because we needed the money so desperately anymore, but because I liked the work, and I liked feeling useful. And I'd keep sitting on this porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood I'd called home for 42 years. One night, a few weeks later, I went up to the attic to put away some old boxes. I opened the Kai box, just to check on the deed and the other important papers, and I found something I hadn't noticed before. Tucked beneath the deed, folded small and neat, was a piece of paper in Rada's handwriting. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully, my old fingers trembling. It was a note, dated just a few months before she died, and it said, "To my stubborn old man, if you're reading this, I know something went wrong. But I also know you'll fix it, because that's what you do. You fix things. And you love our family more than you love being right. That's why I'm alright you. I'll be watching from wherever I am. Don't disappoint me. Love, Rada." I stood there in the dusty attic, holding that note, and I cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from being known, really known, by someone who loved you. She'd written that note for a future she knew she wouldn't be a part of, and she'd trusted me to carry at Four-Way Road. I folded it carefully, put it back in the box, and closed the lid. Then I climbed down from the attic and walked back to the porch, where the evening air was ciel and sweet with the scent of roses. Paul was out there, sitting in my rocking chair, Bella on his lap. He looked up and said, "Everything okay, Dad?" I said everything was fine, better than fine. I sat down in the chair next to him, and we rocked in silence, watching the stars come out, one by one. Bella pointed up and said, "Grandpa, that one's the brightest." I told her that was the North Star, the one that never moved, the one you could always count on to guide you home. She seemed satisfied with that, and she closed her eyes, drifting off again. Paul looked at me over her head, a question in his eyes. I didn't answer it with words. I just nodded, once, slow and sure. And he nodded back. We were home. We'd always been home. We'd just lost sight of it for a little while, that was all. The months passed. The debt got paid off, a little EARLY, thanks to a bonus Paul got at work and the extra hours I'd put in at the garage. Amy's job was going great, she'd already gotten a raise and a promotion, and she was talking about going back to school to finish her degree. Paul sta root coaching Bella's little league team, a ragtag bunch of 6-year-olds who couldn't catch a ball to save their lives, but he loved every minute of it. I watched from the bleachers, my old knees wrapped in a heating pad, cheering louder than anyone. And on a crisp October morning, I got up early and walked out to the garage. The oil stain on the concrete was still there, faded but visible, a reminder of where we'd sta root. I looked at it for a long moment, and then I got a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush, and I knelt down, my bones creaking, and I scrubbed that stain until it was gone. Not all of it, you could still see a faint shadow if you looked close, but the stain was gone. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked back into the house. The sun was coming through the kitchen window, warm and golden. Paul was at the table with Bella, reading her a book. Amy was at the stove, making pancakes. The smell of coffee filled the air. I pulled out my chair, the one I'd sat in for 42 years, and I sat down, and I looked at my family, and I smiled. I don't know what the next chapter holds. Life doesn't come with guarantees, not for anyone. But I know this much, we'll face whatever comes together, the way we always should have. And if something goes wrong, we'll fix it. That's what we do. Now, if you've made it this far with me, through the oil stains and the lies and the long nights of wondering if anything would ever be right again, I want to thank you. I'm just an old man telling a story, but stories are how we make sense of things, how we pass along the bits of wisdom we've picked up along the way. If this one meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family or your own struggles, I'd be grateful if you'd click that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you much, and it tells me there are folks out there who still see about the old-fashioned stuff, the stuff that really matters. I've got plenty more stories where this one came from, stories about roses and baseball and the things that hold a family together when the world tries to pull it apart. So sign on, and I'll see you next time. Until then, take care of each other. That's the only thing that lasts.